I have a distinct memory from over 20 years ago of being at World Gym on Hickson Pike in Chattanooga, pedaling the stationary bike. And I was reading, I'm always reading when I'm on the stationary bike, and I was reading a book by Hugh Prather, who was a very popular spiritual writer back then. And while reading this book, while pedaling the bike, getting my daily workout in, I came across one of those sentences that just leap off of the page. I nearly fell off the bike when I realized the profundity of what I had just read in one sentence. Over 20 years ago, and I can remember that moment. Here's the sentence: practice having no ego, and you will be free. It's a keeper, isn't it? Over 20 years ago, and I can remember the moment when I thought, this is one of the wisest observations I've ever read. And I remember thinking, this is what Jesus' message was in the end. In the end. Put aside your self-concern and have a mindset to serve others in the name of God. Practice having no ego, and you will be free. It's one thing to accept the truth of it, it's another to practice it, isn't it? And that's the journey of life. Taking what we know to be true and making it more of an everyday reality. There's another passage that struck me equally profoundly, again, over 20 years ago. This time I was reading a book by Sam Keene, very popular spiritual writer at that time. Here's the brief passage. It is brief. I'd like to share it with you. In the spiritual journey, the compass unfailingly points toward compassion. This spiritual compass is the equivalent of GPS. Inscribe this single word on your heart: compassion. Whenever you are confused, keep heading in the direction that leads toward deepening your love and care for all living beings, including yourself, and you will never stray far from the path to fulfillment. That one's on the back of my door in my office. It's an amazing insight. And in the middle of the paragraph, there's one sentence. Inscribe this single word on your heart: compassion. At the time, I thought, again, similarly to the observation by Prather, this crystallizes so much what Jesus taught. Story after story in the Gospels end up on a note of compassion. What an insight. Inscribe this single word on your heart: compassion. In Luke 6:36, Jesus is recorded as having said, "Be merciful, just as your Father is merciful." Here again, one sentence that contains so much truth. That's the NRSV translation: be merciful, just as your Father is merciful. The Greek can equally well be translated, be compassionate, just as your Father is compassionate. The words of Jesus himself crystallizing so much of his own teaching. Today's gospel lesson is Luke chapter 13, verses 10 through 17. The subject of the passage is conflict over the meaning of the Sabbath. What's appropriate on the Sabbath and what isn't? This is a recurring theme in Luke's gospel. Back in chapter 6, verses 1 through 5, the disciples are caught plucking heads of grain on the Sabbath because they're hungry. And Jesus is criticized that his followers do work on the Sabbath. And then in the next passage in Luke 6, verses 6 through 11, we read about the healing of a man with a withered hand on the Sabbath. And again, Jesus is criticized for work done on the Sabbath. And then we come to today's passage in Luke 13 with a woman with an orthopedic issue who has been plagued by that issue for 18 years, is healed by Jesus. Again, the criticism comes. There are 6 other days in the week for that. On the Sabbath, we should focus on God. Come back another day and be healed. And then in chapter 14, we read about a man with dropsy. We would say edema today. He's retaining fluid. It's causing real issues for him. This man is healed again on the Sabbath. And Jesus is criticized for not paying due homage to the sacredness of the day. The criticism is recurrent. You've got 6 other days of the week to work. The Sabbath should be held in reserve for religious observation and rest. Of course, Jesus' response to the criticism is crystal clear. What possibly could be more pleasing to God on the Sabbath than an act of mercy and compassion toward one of God's children? In preparing for this sermon, I came across a passage by an anonymous commentator who writes, "Mercy is more important than rigid adherence to rules. Rules have their place. Customs are important to us. Norms do need to be maintained. But mercy, compassion, is more important than rigid adherence to rules." Sometimes we need to be a little flexible, don't we? Sometimes in the moment we need to be willing to adjust and see a greater good that can come from tweaking the rules in that one moment. That anonymous commentator goes on to note, the essence of Sabbath is not in what it forbids, but in what it requires. It's not so much thou shalt not, but thou shalt love the Lord and love His children. I happen to agree with that anonymous commentator. Mercy is more important. Compassion is more important than rigid adherence to rules which may not fit that particular moment or situation. So our passage begins, now Jesus was teaching in one of the synagogues on the Sabbath. This is what he did. Jesus and his disciples went around from village to village, town to town, and he would have asked the leader of the synagogue for permission to speak. And of course, with Jesus' obvious charisma, he would have been granted permission. Imagine a world without any of the means of modern communication that we take for granted. No radio, no television, no newspapers, no internet. Jesus had to be on the move to spread the good news of the kingdom. There was no other way than to go from village to village and town to town and secure permission to speak in the local house of worship. In other words, Jesus met people where they were. People like us, everyday people, with our joys as well as our sorrows, with our illnesses and disabilities. Jesus was out with the people, and his message was one of love and compassion. The section heading over this gospel lesson in my study Bible reads, Jesus heals a crippled woman. Just cuts right to the heart of the issue. This poor woman has suffered for 18 years, Luke tells us. In the house of God, on the Lord's day, what could have been more appropriate than for Jesus to offer healing to this woman? And yet it violated the norms of the time. It violated the customs regarding the Sabbath. And so Luke tells us, but the leader of the synagogue, indignant because Jesus had cured on the Sabbath, kept saying to the crowd, there are 6 days on which work ought to be done. Come on those days and be cured, and not on the Sabbath day. That, my friends, is rigid adherence to rules. What's happening here is, by focusing so much on the trees, the leader of the synagogue has lost sight of the forest. And he's put customs and norms and traditions ahead of an act of mercy, compassion, and healing. Jesus isn't silent regarding the criticism. He says to his critics, you untie your animals on the Sabbath and lead them to water so that they can get a drink. Your oxen and your donkeys, you untie and lead them to water. Isn't that work? Jesus says. And then he says, ought not this woman, a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan bound for 18 long years, be set free from this bondage on the Sabbath day? Jesus is pleading with his critics. Step back from the trees to see the forest. Mercy is more important than rigid adherence to rules. The essence of Sabbath is not in what it forbids, but in what it requires. Inscribe this single word on your heart: compassion. What a truth. What a challenge to remember amidst our struggles. That single word, compassion, will never stray far from the path we're meant to be on if compassion stays in the forefront of our mind. I conclude with this. Today's gospel lesson is in Luke chapter 13. Just a few chapters earlier, in chapter 10, verses 25 through 37, we encounter the parable of the Good Samaritan, one of the most memorable teachings that Jesus ever gave. We know the story. There's a victim. An innocent man is victimized on the road. He's lying in a ditch, badly injured. A priest comes by, a member of the religious hierarchy, and passes by without rendering aid. A Levite passes by, also one of the religious elite, and the Levite passes by without lending aid. And then a Samaritan comes along, a member of a despised ethnic minority, a member of a despised religious minority from the point of view of most Jews in Judea and Galilee. It's not the religious elites who do the right thing. It's the Samaritan. The other is the one who acts out of love, compassion, and mercy. It's an incredible picture that Jesus paints, as relevant today as it was 2,000 years ago when he first told the story. You may remember that at the end of the parable, Jesus says to the lawyer with whom he's in conversation, which of these three do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers. The lawyer has no choice at this point to say, other than to say, the one who showed him mercy, the one who showed him compassion, did the right thing. And Jesus' response is one sentence, one of those one sentences. Go, he says, go and do likewise. Amen.